I'd like to ask the audience to mute your cell phones or other electronic devices, including me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Winnetka Village Council study session for March 12th, 2019. First order of business is public comment, and this is the time of the meeting where anybody who wishes to address the council on items that are not on the agenda, they're welcome to come up to the podium, share their thoughts with us, and we'll be more than happy to listen. Does anybody have any comments that they would like to share? Pat, come on up. Welcome this evening.
3 points that I want to get across this evening. Patricia Balsamo, 1037 Cherry Street, Winnetka. This has to do with the weekend and all the wonderful things that happened this weekend. Number one, I'll go chronologically. Saturday, the Park District had a terrific display of what some of its ideas are for restoring the beaches. And I think the more citizen support and input that we all can give will further our goals, but it was a very well done production. And then talking about productions, Sunday afternoon was absolutely fantastic. The Planning Committee, Nan Greenow and Louise Holland and Ann Erickson and our own village president, Chris Renz, and I saw at least 4 trustees together, and I was a little bit worried about that until I realized the size of this meeting. I thought, well, that would be okay. Very, very special celebration of Winnetka's sesquicentennial. It's the kind of thing that calls attention to the village and makes all of the residents feel very proud of living here. Third point, the League of Women Voters has done a study of the District 36 referendum proposal. And the study consisted of interviews, extensive interviews with the administration of the schools, visits to all 5 schools, reviews of materials that were given to us by various sources, including of course, the school administration, but also proponents for the referendum and people who opposed the referendum. We listened very carefully to everyone and put our study together. And finally, Tuesday, that's today, yesterday, we met and voted on our position regarding the referendum. And I'm very pleased to say that the League of Women Voters of Winnetka, Northfield, Kenilworth supports District 36 referendum for the schools. So remember that when you go to vote on April 2nd or before. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Would anybody else like to address the council? Seeing none, we'll close the public comment session, and we'll move on to our main topic of the evening. Private road, I guess it says here, policy discussion. First off, I want to apologize to you all and to the audience too, because I really didn't have a chance to I never get a chance to review the packet before it goes out. I usually get a look at the agenda, but and to be honest with you, I felt I knew everything I needed to run the meeting, so I didn't look at the packet until like Sunday night. And by then, obviously, it was a little bit late in the game to get the word out. But I did send an email out to several of the private road representatives, and a little background on why I'd like to talk about this tonight. There's multiple pieces to it. The first one is that if you read your packet, there was discussions on this back in 2008 when we, worked with Trap Lane. Some trustees supported it, some didn't. And, and there was a lot of interesting conversation about the whole concept of private roads becoming public roads, and equity issues, and all sorts of things were part of that conversation. And, Ed Woodbury at that point in time was on his way out of service, and he had a lot of other things that he wanted to accomplish before he stepped out that following May. And he kind of left it, and I think it was very appropriate even in the minutes. He said, well, let some other council pick it up. We seem to be picking up a lot of old stuff around here lately, but I think that's a good thing as well. But my whole, and really, the letter or the email I received from Rob Apatow was just one more conversation in many that I've had with private road people over the last couple of years. I've heard from DeWint, I've talked to the folks at Sunset. Obviously, Rob, you and I have had conversations. I ran into somebody on Sunview when I was out walking the dog and, chewing my ear off about it then. I mean, you just happen to have people that talk to you about this and have thoughts about it and perspectives. And in and of itself, that's interesting, but the reality of it is that as we move into our stormwater discussions, this becomes a significant issue, and one that I think it's important for us to have thought about it a little bit and have been judicious in considering what policies are currently on the book and whether we want to make any, modifications to them. While the equity discussion back in 2008 on one particular item was kind of floating around in the periphery, I mean, is that something that we want to also address in a policy statement? Because as we start working on stormwater, a lot of these private roads have a dog in that fight, so to speak. And we want to make sure that we have a set of rules that, has been discussed at the community level, and that we know where we're going and what the rules of the road are as we start talking about putting storm drainage lines in here and there and everywhere else. So my whole idea tonight was really for us as a council and the private road associations or non-associations or whatever, however you're legally formed, is just to understand what the rules of the road are. What is the policy, maybe a little bit of history on where that came from. What are our touch points? What things do we have ability and flexibility in? And what things don't we have flexibility and ability in? It was interesting because one of the pieces in the packet, and I'm not sure, Steve, if you'll hit on this, but in reading the old minutes, the only once did we see the village attorney weigh in on the legality of doing anything, of the village doing anything on private roads, and it was dismissed in 10 seconds. It was just simply, no, you can't do that. And we all kind of stepped back and just accepted that at face value. So it would be interesting to know, what are our obligations, limitations, and, potential abilities to effect work on these, both if a road remains private or if it becomes public. So there's a lot of little pieces to this. This meeting was not intended to debate whether or not the Ardsley request should be considered, move forward, denied, anything like that at all. So I really apologize for that, because I think the way the agenda was structured, it kind of misled you if you were just reading it from the cold, that was going to be a topic for a discussion. I'm not prepared to address it because I don't know what the rules are. So that's why I thought it would be good to get Steve out here, have him give us a little rundown on history, and luckily we have somebody who's a font of knowledge in this and who's been here from just about the beginning. So I think he'll be able to shed a lot of light on how we got to where we are today, and then we can kind of talk a little bit about where we want to go. So I'll let Steve and actually Tim put together a really interesting sort of math exercise that'll help enlighten us on some cost issues that might inform the equity conversation a little bit.
Chris?
Yeah.
Just before we move ahead, First of all, I had dental work done today, so I apologize if I'm mumbling. So if you,
drooling over
yeah, right. If you can't understand me, please ask me to repeat. Your notion of equity, can you just elaborate? I just want to make sure we're all thinking about the same thing.
Well, my notion of equity doesn't matter. It's really what the parties who are either receiving it or not receiving it believe that it's equitable. I mean, equity can mean a lot of things, and, without getting into it deeply, let's face it, the tax system is far from equitable in any way, shape, or form. We made a little incremental move towards equitable assignment of costs and village service provision when we moved the refuse fee out, right? And the idea behind that was, if you have a big tax bill, you pay a lot more to have the same bucket of trash moved than if you have a little tax bill. So we moved that off of there because we felt it was equitable that everybody, if you've got a bucket of trash, whether you live east, west, north, or south, that you should pay the same. So, in the equity in private roads, I think revolves around, or at least the perceived equity, that we're paying taxes, but we're not getting any maintenance out in front of our house. And I've got some thoughts about that, but not for now. That's more for our conversation later. But it really is just the fact that some private roads may perceive that their tax bill is inequitable, considering the services they refuse from lot line to lot line out in front of their home.
Great. Thank you for the
Sure.
clarification. I just want to be sure.
And I've talked enough already, so we'll just go ahead and let Steve get the show on the road. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you. Good evening. Sorry to have my back to you all, but the council and the camera and all that. I've got a PowerPoint presentation that basically summarizes the agenda materials. I think it's 13 or 14 slides, so stop and ask questions anytime. So this was first sort of generated by a request from the Ardsley and Pelham Road Association, which is shown here in the red square. The two squiggly lines are Ardsley Road that run north-south, Pelham Road that run east-west. And when that neighborhood was originally subdivided, the roadway was put within an easement, but it was kept on private property. So it was never dedicated as public roadways. And the village has a number of private streets. I think 23 streets and about 6.4 miles of the village's total roadway is what are called private streets. So what are private streets versus public streets? On public streets, when the original land was subdivided, there was an area of land that was dedicated over to the village as public property where the roadways and the utilities were located. So, and that's called a right-of-way. So when you look at a plat of subdivision, usually you'll see all the lots marked out, and then you'll see the rights-of-way. Sometimes you'll see public alleys. But those are strips of village-owned property that are basically laid out for the roadway and the appurtenant utilities. When that subdivision is completed, the roadway then becomes essentially publicly owned. The utilities that are located in those public rights-of-way are publicly owned, either village-owned or, in the case of like phone and gas and cable, investor-owned. And then the land dedicated for right-of-way is publicly owned and therefore tax exempt. In some subdivisions, in the early part of the 20th century, the developer, for whatever reason, and we'll talk about a couple of reasons in a moment, the developer did not dedicate sections of property to the public. So they constructed the road and the utilities within an easement. Now, what an easement is privately owned property where the property owner has given away certain rights for either ingress and egress or access or utilities, and the roadways were constructed and the utilities were constructed within those easements. Those roadways and appurtenances like signs and sometimes a street lighting system and other things in those easements are privately owned. They were constructed by the developer when the subdivision was built. They were never given over to the village for ownership and maintenance because there was no public property transferred with it. And so the utilities that are underneath, the sanitary sewer, the water mains, and the investor-owned utilities are either village or investor-owned, except for the storm sewers, because they drain private property and the privately owned roadway. So the storm sewers under those private roadways are privately owned, and the land within the roadway and utility easements is kept on the tax roll, so it's taxable, because it's privately owned. If you look at subdivision parcels or our GIS mapping, you'll see the lot lines go all the way out to the middle of the street. It's part of a parcel that has a county PIN number, and so it's all privately owned. So why are there private streets in Winnetka? As I mentioned, they came into being when the land was originally subdivided. So as Winnetka grew and there were additions and subdivisions and land added to the village, most of the subdivisions in the village, the developer contemplated public streets. So they laid out a right-of-way, usually 66 feet wide. They put in sidewalks, they put in all the utilities, they put in the roadway, and then the lots were accessed off of those streets. But during some of the subdivision process, for whatever reason, this goes back to the teens and 20s and 30s and 40s, the developer chose to keep the street private. The village council approved the subdivisions in that condition, and so the roadways, then the subdivision was approved, everything was built, and the roadways were kept private. Some likely factors include greater design and maintenance freedom. So when you're subdividing and you're coming into the village and you're going to give the village a street, the village is going to say, okay, fine, you got to build it so wide, you got to have curbs, you got to have sidewalks, you got to meet our design standards, et cetera. On a private street, the village says, well, we're not going to own it. If you want to make it a little narrower and you don't want to put curbs on and you want to have kind of a country feel or whatever, that's okay. You're going to own it, you're going to maintain it. So that may have been one motivating factor. Just to be crass, it can also reduce the upfront costs for the developer if they don't have to put in sidewalks, if they don't have to build the base as thick, they don't have to build the pavement as thick. It saves them a little money up front, and then the lots are sold and the developer moves on and the private property owners maintain the street. Now, for many years, the subdivision code has prevented creation of new private streets. That, frankly, was sort of closing the barn door after the horse was out, because we have so many of them, but I don't know, sometime probably back in the 50s or 60s, the subdivision code was changed so that private streets are no longer something that can be created. So where are the private streets in Winnetka? This doesn't show up as well on the projection. It's in your packet, and there's copies of the PowerPoint on the table over there if you want to take along. But the areas shown in red, see if my cursor works. So this is Ardsley Pelham here, but there's Holly and Plumtree and Westmore to the west of Hibbard, White Oak, Sunset, DeWint, Thorntree, Indian Hill, Private Road, Fisher Crescent, White Bridge Hill. So these are all of the private streets shown in red within the village. So they're scattered throughout the village. You'll notice that most of the smaller lot, kind of more densely developed areas, these are all public streets through this area. So the village's policy on dedicating existing private streets was reviewed and revised and approved in October of 1994 by the village council. This policy actually was reviewed, but it was a review of a policy that village staff had for a number of years and kind of affirmed by the council in response to one of the very early iterations of the roughly 20 years of discussion that took place to get the Trap Lane project approved. You're laughing, but that's actually true. And so the key provisions, the land that is in the existing easement has to be dedicated to the village as a right-of-way. If the village is going to take over the street, we have to take over the property underneath it so that we have public property on which we can build and maintain a street in perpetuity going forward. The policy requires, or it desires a 50-foot right-of-way. Our standard right-of-way is actually 66 feet, but recognizing that most of the private roads were constructed with much narrower easements than that. The desired easement width is 50 feet, but that easement can be a roadway right-of-way plus additional easements on the outside for utilities, which is the way that we were able to get Trap Lane done. They dedicated over to the village the entire egress easement, and then additional utility easements on either side of the right-of-way. If there's a dead end, there has to be an appropriately designed cul-de-sac or hammerhead turnaround. The streets have to be brought up to village design standards, including curbs, pavement thickness, and a sidewalk on at least one side, and an appropriate storm sewer system with a minimum pipe diameter of 10 inches, but actually designed for the runoff from the subdivision must be provided. The policy goes on to state that any costs associated with the dedication and improvement of the existing streets, storm sewers, and other appurtenances to bring them up to village standards is to be borne by the owners of the property, either a homeowners association if you're lucky, or just the property owners that are affected. And the village doesn't assume any maintenance responsibilities until all the improvements have been completed and the street dedication has been accepted by the village. So that's the policy as it was in October 1994, and that continued in place until Trap Lane sort of reappeared in 2008. And the council undertook a pretty thorough review of the policy. And the details, all the agenda materials and the minutes of those meetings are in your packet. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but essentially the council was looking at primarily whether the village should in some way financially contribute to the construction of private streets and appurtenant storm sewers, and whether there would be recapture provisions to recoup some of the village's investment. Unfortunately, the summary of those 4 meetings was not really a consensus to make any changes to the policy, so that October 1994 policy remains in effect. We did go ahead and construct the Trap Lane improvements, so we were able to reach an agreement with that homeowners association. So that's the only street that was originally dedicated as a private roadway that has been dedicated over to the village. There are some practical considerations associated with dedicating private streets. Probably one of the biggest hurdles, and actually the biggest hurdle in the Trap Lane discussions, was that the dedication of the necessary easements and right-of-way has to be voluntary, and it has to be unanimous. In other words, we can't have discontinuous stretches of private ownership, public ownership, private ownership, public ownership. So the land has to be, at least for the easement portion, that land actually has to be transferred over to the village. The village has not exercised eminent domain, and I don't think there's much of an appetite to do that. So it has to be a voluntary transfer over to the village. And I can tell you from personal experience with the Trap Lane that it took turnover of a number of residents who were pretty much dead set against transferring over any of their ownership interest before we could get to unanimity on that. Perhaps an equally important practical consideration is the way that our zoning ordinance calculates things like setbacks and lot coverage and gross floor area is related to where existing property lines, easement lines, and lot areas are calculated. And so when the easements are dedicated over to the village, those lot lines and lot areas change, and often they can create both nonconformities, which make future development or redevelopment of existing properties more problematic. And they can also, depending on how drastic a change, they can actually have an impact on a property value if they reduce the buildable area or require a greatly changed setback on maybe a strangely shaped lot. So we spent a lot of time, again, with the Trap Lane residents, just looking at those zoning parameters and trying to come up with a right-of-way and easement configuration that minimize the negative impacts from a zoning perspective, both from being able to administer the zoning ordinance without a bunch of nonconformities, but also not creating hardships for existing property owners. And then a third practical consideration is just the level of effort that's required to sort of do the upfront evaluation of the existing condition of the street. So you have to do pavement cores and geometric analyses and televise the storm sewer and do runoff calculations and those kinds of things. And that comes with a cost, an upfront cost, to do an engineering evaluation with pavement cores. You might be looking at $10,000 or $15,000 up front before you even know what you're going to have to invest in the actual infrastructure to bring it to village standards. As far as financing private street improvements, there's really two ways, general approaches that can be taken. The easiest and fastest is a simple upfront payment. That's easy to administer because it allows the affected homeowners association to figure out how they want to divvy up the costs. So they could do it by front footage or equal basis or however they want, as long as the sum comes up to 100%. The village doesn't really care. There's a couple of disadvantages on that. One is that's kind of a complicated negotiation. And the other is that the village can't really amortize that over time. As my friend Brian Keyes likes to say, no bucks, no trucks. It's payment up front. The other is a special service area, which is a special taxing district, which is used to fund public improvements in a discrete geographic area. There's a spelled out process, and there's a handout in your agenda packet from S.B. Friedman that lays out in more detail, but you require a public hearing, you have to have an ordinance that introduced, and there's a waiting period where people in the special service area can petition against it. At the end of the day, though, it's basically a tax levy. So it is distributed among the affected properties based on equalized assessed value. There's really no flexibility in how that is. So, if you want everybody to pay the same, you can't get there with an SSA. It's just whatever the proportional EAV is. But it can be amortized over time. So you can set it up with a repayment schedule of 5 years, 10 years. I think the max it goes out to is 15. Is that right, Ben, on an SSA? But it can be amortized over a period of time once you go through the specific process to create the SSA. We did, in preparation of this meeting, we did survey some of our other North Shore counterpart communities. We tried to get responses from 7 communities. Northbrook didn't get back to us. Highland Park and Northfield both have written policies, frankly very similar to the village's policy. Those were included in your agenda packet. The other 4 didn't have formal written policies, but the guidance that they gave us, again, was very similar to the way that the village handles dedication of private roads. And in each case, each community requires that the existing infrastructure be evaluated and brought up to their village standards before dedication occurs. And in each case, each of the other municipality required all the associated costs to be borne by either the road association or the affected property owners. So, with that summary, I'd be glad to entertain any questions, and we can discuss how you want to move forward.
Steve, what were some of the reasons that people on Trap Lane held out? Do you have any sense of like what it was?
They were varied. The one that sticks most sharply in my mind was an individual actually sat in a meeting with me and said, "That's my property and I have guns." Literally, that was literally what that individual said. There was, in some cases, there was concern about giving up sort of the right to control what happens on a street. As a private street, you kind of have control over your signs. You can put speed bumps on. There's things that you can do on a private street that you can't on a public street. There was some concerns about the design standards. Trap Lane was very narrow. It was 16 feet wide. We had to widen it a little bit. There was some tree impacts that people were concerned about. So there was a variety of reasons that we couldn't get unanimity over a period of time.
Steve, I have a couple of questions about cost. Do you know the cost to service a mile of street annually, like just in terms of for the public way that we have, or can we get at that cost, including snow removal and leaf removal and all that other kind of stuff?
We could come up with something close from the budget information, and we've got about 52 miles of streets. I don't know that off the top of my
Yeah,
head, but
so if we could look at that, and the other cost question that I would have is, what would be the per mile cost or the per, half mile cost, taking those 6.4 miles and assuming that we were going to convert them all? What would be the total number that we're looking at for everything? And then, how does that look on whatever the basis is that most communities, although I know it varies, because I actually live on a private road, and I don't even know if I should be recused out of this conversation. I asked, and they said no. But I would be curious to know what would be the total cost for converting 6.4 miles into village appropriate
sure.
street.
If you use Trap Lane as sort of a benchmark, which it'll be on the high end because we had to do a lot of work on that street, and some associations take a little bit better care of the roads. But Trap Lane was about, all in with engineering, was about $500 a foot. It was $500,000, and it was 1,020 feet long. So you can do the math to come up with the 6.4 miles to 17 million, okay. But again, that Trap Lane was perhaps on the high end because some of the streets already have curb and gutter, some are wider than others, some are in better condition, some have better storm sewers. So Trap Lane basically had to get dug down to the dirt and rebuilt from scratch.
Are we open for questions? Is that,
Yeah, we can go ahead and at least,
so as these new streets, let's pretend we're going to go ahead and do the engineering for the street. I'm assuming some of these streets are probably or possibly in floodplain?
There's a few of them. So Sunset, DeWint, White Oak, so the ones down in that area.
Necessary storage on
You
the
would-
properties adjoining them, right?
You would if you significantly change the grade of the existing street. If you tried to keep it pretty close to where it's at, the comp storage would be minimal.
And the stormwater that currently on those roads, the connection point to the city storm sewers, is that pretty obvious where they connect and,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so the storm sewers on the private streets, they come to a storm sewer that's underneath a public street, and the village takes care of the main that's on the public street. And just like on your house, the storm sewer that serves your property, once it leaves the village main, it's your responsibility.
And as far as the zoning goes, typically you would be, whatever right of way you cut away, if you lose front yard setback or any of that, would just be existing non-conforming, and that could be built into the agreement, right? Or that's how it would come into the property as non-conforming?
I would assume it would, I mean, so we, for example, a good example is we've got some lots along Foxdale Avenue, on the west side of Foxdale Avenue, and the railroad came through and condemned a strip for the North Shore Electric Railroad. And all of a sudden, those lots became non-conforming because they were too small. And so when those cases come up before the zoning ordinance, that's a factor in evaluating their, but it takes that extra step because they're non-conforming. That takes them to the zoning board because now you're dealing with a non-conformity.
Right, for future development, it could definitely hurt their ability to put an addition on or.
That's right.
Or
That's right.
setback or.
That's right.
Or area coverage on it. Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a couple, sorry, my back is turned to you. For the first, 10, 12 years, I lived in Winnetka, we lived on Hill Terrace, and we actually looked at going, getting that street turned over, and you're right, the expense, particularly since it's such a small street, the expense was high for what the value would be, and the lots were small, so that the impact on the FAR and, whatever was significant. My understanding at that time was that with a private road, the village had say over the access points, but aside from that, it was pretty much up to us. We controlled what happened on the interior. Hill Terrace is not a through street, it's blocked off at one end, but for through streets, and many of these are, like Ardsley and many of them, what control do the homeowners have over who can access those streets?
I guess I would first of all defer to Ben, but to some extent that's going to depend on the way that the easement language is written for the ingress egress easements.
Yeah, and a lot of the private roads, the rules are set by the owner. So if it's an association, they're able to dictate a large degree what they want to do in terms of who comes on the private property. Now, generally, obviously, they're not gated. They're open to the public, and there's a general ingress and egress easement for road purposes that would be granted. And certainly, they're not generally kicking off people who happen to drive down that road. But they are responsible for setting the rules themselves, and you'd have to look at the governing documents of the individual the private road and then that association to determine what exactly the boundaries are of the rights of the public to access those.
Yeah, I never, have really engaged in this conversation, but some of those roads are pretty significant thoroughfares. So I don't know whether they would have the possibility of being able to close off or not, or anyway, that's just a question I have. The other one is relative to, I just lost my thought. How many houses on a lane or driveway or whatever would be defined as a street?
I think in the zoning ordinance it's 3. Is that right, David?
3?
Yeah.
Right. When I think of my other one, right, exactly.
Can we go to the policy on dedicating existing streets? So there's certain factors that says, okay, we want 50-foot wide streets. Any dead end has to have a cul-de-sac. We want to have a sidewalk. Are these wants? Are these requirements the way they're written now? How, I guess, how important is it that if we were to look at one of these private streets and it was 40 feet wide with no sidewalks, but it was in good condition, is there anything saying, okay, well, we have to take it up to 50 feet?
So I guess the answer to that is twofold. First of all, this is a policy, and so at the end of the day, the council can do what it wants, but the policy is based on the design standards that the village has had in place for many years. So our standard pavement width on a public street is for a residential street is 22 feet wide, back of curb to back of curb, with a parkway and a 5-foot sidewalk on either side, and enough right-of-way. Our standard right-of-way is 66 feet. The minimum right-of-way that's contemplated in the subdivision ordinance is 50 feet. That's where some of these standards came from. And that's roadway plus sidewalks plus utilities plus trees plus signs, streetlights, et cetera.
Which makes sense when laying out a new street, but
Right.
obviously we deal with pre-existing conditions
Right.
here.
Right.
So there's nothing, so I'm thinking of a fire truck, right? There's a certain width that a fire
Yep.
truck needs to get down, for safety.
Yeah.
Beyond safety factors, are there requirements that would say, geez, these policies really, in a sense, are non-negotiable? Or are all of them, somewhat negotiable? We don't want to have 10-foot streets, but we've got a fair degree of flexibility.
Yeah, so I think you would probably want to stay as consistent with your subdivision ordinance as you can, just for consistency of development and future subdivisions and things. I won't presume to speak for Mark Hornstein or Alan Burkowski, but I'm sure they have minimums and strong desires for width of turnaround areas and things for fire access. There are transportation engineering standards on lane widths based on length of the street and speed and how many driveways and whether it's straight or curved, and we would bring those standards into play. But at the end of the day, there's some reasonable flexibility. The council can make policy decisions because that's what you're elected to do.
And we have a fairly wide range of private roads in terms of their width and their condition, as well as how heavily they're traveled.
We do, yeah.
Just, I mean, to reinforce on that, I was going to ask, that I have seen, and I live also next to a non-conforming public road where there are no sidewalks and it's narrower than what would be. So I assume that that had been a private road or somehow, because it was older, it was grandfathered in.
Which street?
Kent.
The east-west section of Kent? I'm not sure the provenance of that. I know that there are streets that were built like without curbs throughout the village, and we've been adding curbs, I think everything except maybe, I think Kent and Mount Pleasant are really the only two streets left without curbs. And when we put curbs in, we try to widen them out to the 22-foot standard.
Yeah, because the tough part, I think, without the curb, when you go from a private road to a street with curbs, you want the curbs to hold the pavement in.
Correct.
And then you come down a narrow street, if you park on the street with a curb, you need a little wider street. Whereas a lot of private roads, you're parking a little bit off in the gravel and the mud on party nights or people come over.
We need to be able to get an ambulance past a fire truck.
Right.
Well, on that point, though, I think that, from a safety standpoint, presumably, there have been fire trucks and police cars and so on going down these streets forever for 300 years or whatever. So but to follow up on Scott's point, which, if we assume for a second that a number of these streets are already very non-conforming, and they were, for whatever reason, 100 years ago, I think Robbie told me Ardsley was 1920 or something like that, and there haven't been too many of these in the last 50 or 60 years that have turned over. If we're looking at a policy ultimately, we're looking to work within this framework of ad hoc streets and so on. And it would seem to me as we think about this, we need to think about, ultimately an end game that allows for, if we want to do this, private roads to ultimately, rededicate or dedicate their property to the village, but also maintain the character of their neighborhoods.
Right.
And so,
Just like we do with zoning.
to say that we just, abide by the current, plat and subdivisions and so on and so forth, I think kind of locks us out of that flexibility. You're not advocating that, I'm not saying you are, but it would seem to me we got to go in this with flexibility to work with the associations or the homeowners, but at the same time, maintain the interests of the village, financially and all that type of thing. So, maybe there's a way to get a win-win policy going here that, maintains these really beautiful roads where they can become public roads.
Of the 6 miles, how many have an association approximately? Do you have any idea?
Not by mileage. I know of the 23, there's just a handful that have formal associations.
Because most likely, one of the associations ideally should have had maintenance payments, escrow account or something set up.
You could assume so. but
And then
yeah.
maybe when they were built, were there associations that just died? Do we have records of how those are created back then, or?
There are records of the subdivisions. The completeness of those records varies from subdivision to subdivision. There are some very formalized associations. The Trap Lane one was formal. Indian Hill has a formal association. There are some where there's sort of a volunteer informal mayor that just kind of takes care of things and goes and knocks on doors and asks people to write checks for things, so.
Because the most economical way to fix the roads is to keep them private and fix them as private driveways, basically, versus building the city streets and turning them over. That's just my thinking. It is.
I didn't get that, John.
The most economical way to, if all you want to do, the cheapest way is to keep the streets private and have them repave the road.
Have the-
The
The
homeowners.
cheapest, you're saying.
Right.
Well,
Most economical.
I think we're getting far afield with that concept, John, so I do have a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. I thought you
No, go ahead, Penny.
were, I remembered my question.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I thought you were pulling a discussion.
No, I wasn't.
The question is about the storm sewers in the private roads.
Mhm.
And those are all private, correct? The storm sewers?
There's one section on Blackthorn Road where the village ran a storm sewer through Blackthorn Road to get from one side to the other, and we maintain that because it drains a public neighborhood and goes to another public neighborhood, and Blackthorn's tied into that. The rest of them are all private.
So as we were looking at our storm water system overall and, problem areas, problem spots, how has development over time, how have those stormwater systems been handled by the private system?
Ad hoc, so when the village engineering staff reviews a development on a private road, we require the developer to show that they have permission to connect into the storm sewer system.
And the capacity of those private systems have been sufficient to,
Well, that's why we're
debatable.
talking about stormwater.
right, exactly. Well, that's
The
why-
answer to that would be no. Fundamentally, no. Maybe a couple of them work, but
Okay.
The
let's
bigger
face
question
it.
Probably is, on the entire stormwater plan that's being worked on now, the geographical areas of these areas are included in the main storm piping, I would assume.
No.
The watershed.
They're in the watershed, but that's part of what we're going to have to wrestle with as we get into the conveyance component of stormwater, is understanding what the limits are, what we can do, what we can't do, and, how far we can go. And, in some cases, we have to, just because, like what Steve said with Blackthorn, we have some areas that we know we got to get, the most efficient way of getting conveyance from point A to point B is down the middle of a private road potentially. And so those are the sort of things that this policy might help to inform as we're going forward. I had a question for Ben. And, it's funny how stuff just rolls around in your head for 11 years and then you finally get a chance to spew it out. And Sandy, you might remember this. I mean, Kathy Janica cut off that conversation on what the village could do on a private road in about 30 seconds, right? I mean, it was just basically, I say so, and that was the end of it. And I want to hear what you have to say. Not that I'm asking you to contradict our previous village attorney, but what are, number one, are there any village obligations? What are the limitations for us entering onto private roads and providing service? And I know we haven't budgeted for it or anything, don't get worried about that, but it's just, just to understand, what are the limitations and the restrictions and the like that we would have to navigate having that sort of a conversation?
So, big picture, the general answer is that,
You're good there.
is that out of the goodness of your heart, you cannot just decide to spend public funds to improve private roads. The section, or Article 8, Section 1 of the Constitution of Illinois says public funds, property, or credit shall be used only for public purposes. Now, the nuance to this, and there is a nuance, is that incidental private benefit from use of public funds for a public purpose is permissive. So think about public-private partnerships and all sorts of deals that we enter into with private contractors, with private property owners. We do that all the time. We will place easements on private property and may even make payment to a private owner to put in a public improvement. But the key is that the purpose and the intent of your legislation, of your policymaking, has to be to fulfill a public purpose. So it cannot be that we believe, you know, that if you're thinking, you know, for those residents who happen to live on a private road, we want to help them out, we feel bad for the costs that they incur, so we're going to help with paving. That would not be constitutional, and you would not be able to spend the village's public funds to help with that be for a private purpose. If, however, there was a public benefit, and that was the clear and purposeful intent, nothing you know, you would not be precluded from entering into agreements and partnering and working if you thought there was a public benefit. The example being, you just mentioned, for example, stormwater. If you decided that you wanted an easement and you needed to put in substantial stormwater improvements, and the best way to do it to help the public and the village was to do so under a private road, and at the end of that, as part of the negotiation, as part of the deal, was a paving aspect that you were going to restore, and it would result in fixing or paving a private road, that would be okay because your primary purpose is the public benefit, and it's only incidental to the fact that there was an improvement that went to a private property owner. So it's a case-by-case analysis. We would have to look at each road and what the reason is and what the ask is, and but that's that really is where the boundary is.
Okay.
Well, wait, on that, Ben.
That's a better answer than what we got the last time, don't you
What
think,
if-
Sandy?
What if the intent is to make the road a public road? Then can you make it a public benefit? So if you want to make the private road public road.
Then it's a public road, and it falls under
So
the,
is that a public benefit? So then you could spend the $17.4 million as a village to convert all the private roads to public roads.
Yep, no, absolutely. We could pursue through various means, whether it, eminent domain, whether it's by agreement and accepting a dedication. That's certainly permissive. But again, that becomes public, and that's clearly public benefit. The issue is when you want to leave the roads in the private hands, not make them, public, keep them private, but we're using public funds just to improve them, repave them, put in curbs because take the equitable argument, every other road has curbs. Wouldn't it be nice if we helped out our neighbors? While that may be a wonderful aim, that would not be permitted because there wouldn't be a public purpose behind that.
gotcha. So what I want to do is, just to keep this moving along, Tim Sloth put together, and Tim, I don't want you to go through all the painful whatevers, but I just want you to run through, because, the question I had was, just take a typical private road and a typical lot on a private road, use a typical valuation for tax purposes, and, how much are we talking about that a person living on a private road in a typical house, how much of their tax bill is dedicated to what's the roadway? I mean,
How much tax benefit is the road, the private road?
Is that in this?
Yeah,
okay, so say that again. How much benefit, tax benefit, meaning to the village, I hate to say that because we're all neighbors here anyway, but how much tax benefit accrues to the village relative to the private road portion, right? Is that what you were looking
So,
at?
yeah, how much of the assessment, the total properties assessment, is driven by that portion that is the private road? So in a typical assessment that's of a house that's on a public road, we know, as Steve said, the street is not part of the full assessment. But where the house is on a frontage of a private road, the property boundary extends, halfway into that private road. So you have one house on one side and one on the other. They meet in the middle. Half of that sliver of roadway gets picked up in the assessed value of that property. So the part that's picked up in the assessed value is roughly, 2 to 3% of the total EAV of the house. And this was according, had a conversation with the deputy New Trier assessor, the deputy assessor for New Trier Township, so roughly 2 to 3%. So in the example I provided, if someone had a total equalized assessed value.
Do we have a slide for that, or
Yeah,
no?
unfortunately, it didn't have a slide for it. But if they had an equalized assessed value of $425,000, the road portion was about $9,500 of that total
Stop
assessed
right there.
value.
So an EAV of 425 equals a fair market value of,
It could depend on the type of house that would be there, but in the example, it was about $1.4, $1.5 million.
okay.
So the road portion of that total equalized assessed value came to about 2.25%. So then, as we know that the tax on that assessed value, the village is a portion of that tax. So that the tax rate for all districts is 0.07846%. The village rate is 0.00994. And I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers out. I'll try and
That's
clarify
your
it.
job.
So the skinny of it, the total tax bill would have been around $33,385, with the village portion being 12.67%. So the taxes attributable to that roadway, the taxes that are generated from that additional assessed value from that sliver of roadway attached to the property, came out to $745, and that would be to all taxing districts. So the village portion was $94, or, basically 0.28% of this, sample property's total tax bill. The dollars was generated from that sliver portion of the roadway that's in the assessed value.
And we don't understand it tonight, because we don't have the numbers, what portion of that $94 goes to Public Works road improvements?
Well, in theory, it'd be, the portion that would go to the Public Works, I mean, when we put together our budget, it's, I guess general fund, not necessarily for Public Works, but about 50% of the property tax levy goes to fund the general fund. And then, there's other services besides Public Works, there's the police, there's the fire, and there's additional services beyond Public Works.
So someone with a $33,000 property tax bill, the road portion would be $745, of which $94 actually comes to the village, and the rest of it goes to District 36, or New Trier, or the county, or
Correct.
Wait,
CO
no,
abatement.
Yeah.
that's not, no, you're saying that the portion that would be deeded a road, that they're paying for because they're paying for the lot line extending to the road, to the middle, right, where they've joined the other property. You're just taking that sliver.
Right.
So, but I think the more relevant value of the payment to the village is not on the sliver of road that they're also paying tax on, since I think I should recuse myself, but it's really on the
No.
entire lot. What is the amount that you're paying in taxes for roads as an owner of that entire lot? Because you're not seeing the value reinvested into your street that's in front of you, whereas everyone else who pays taxes on their entire lot is enjoying the benefits of the public streets that surround them, being cared for, taking care of whatever those numbers are, per foot that it costs to service roads.
So
They're
you're
seeing the
saying
direct effect.
you're saying the percentage of the 4224, not the percentage of the 90?
No.
'Cause 42
Well,
Can I
No,
paint it-
I'm
The
saying the
42
percentage of the entire tax.
Right, that's the 4224 is the village portion of the entire lot.
Okay.
But I don't, okay, so the analogy is, let's take a state road, right? So let's take Waukegan Road as a state road. I never drive on Waukegan Road south of Gulf, but yet in my state tax bill, I'm paying to maintain that road, right? Is that fair or is that not fair?
Yeah.
But I don't.
Well-
I never do.
Well, I don't want to debate that part,
So- no, no, no,
because this is where it
but
gets...
But I guess the analogy is, as a resident of a private road, you're paying to drive on all the other roads
True.
in Winnetka.
Right.
And the cost that's in your tax bill is only for the 52 miles.
True, but I mean, the degradation to my value of my home, look where taxes are, right now. Not that I hate paying taxes, I like paying taxes, but philosophically, were I less enthusiastic about paying taxes, you know, I'm a good community person, but what I'm trying to say is that you're penalized twice as a homeowner on a private road. And I think that's why everybody's sitting here tonight. Because you have to pay taxes on the extension of your property. You have a larger piece of property, overly large, because you're paying taxes on an area that's road, and other people don't have to pay tax on the road area of their property, period, because your lot line ends. Now, okay, your lot is smaller, so you go from an acre to 0.9 of an acre, all right, if you had that road was actually deeded as a road. But, and so maybe, you know, zoning-wise, you can do more, you know, construction, you have more leniency or something like that, comes with having the greater lot line.
Yeah, there's a value to that.
Sort of.
No, there definitely is.
But so you're paying on the extended sort of bloated notion of what your property is, and you're not receiving the services to take care of that piece of road, which you're supplementing, and you're paying into, I agree that we should all support community, and I'm going to drive south on Waukegan, and I think I should pay for it, but the fault or the injury to the homeowner is that you're paying taxes on a larger piece and you're not seeing the services delivered. And so it is a continued thing. And I think it feels bad to say it, like you don't want to feel like curmudgeonly and you know, what was the guy, Scroogey, about it. You don't want to feel like, oh, well, because obviously if you're living on a private road, most of those roads are nice and you have a beautiful home and it's a beautiful area. So you don't want to be mean about, you know, your contributions to this village that's beautiful. But still, at the same time, it should be recognized as sort of an injury of sorts.
But the
Good.
tax on the remaining property is your police, fire, everything else that the village.
Yeah, it would be nice to know whether the streets were 10% or 5%
Right.
or 3%,
But it's
because
not
that would
like
inform the
thousands.
conversation,
Right, and
right? No?
to fill,
Can I be honest with you
Yeah,
guys? I think
that's
this-
what you're here
I think
for.
this is like a rabbit falling down a hole kind of a discussion. If we want to get so granular as to figure out how much of my tax dollar goes to the street immediately in front of my house, I think we can all stipulate it's going to be a small number.
Right.
And that's probably not the driver
But
for
you're
the
not
dis-
paying tax on that road. You're not paying tax on that property.
I think if you look at like my $38,000 tax bill and you parse it out to the Elm Street and Maple Street and you say how much of that 38,000 goes to the village and then actually goes to these roads, it's gonna be a tiny amount. So my point is, it's probably not the basis for making a decision on this issue. Because we could cut it a million different ways. I don't necessarily agree or disagree. I simply don't have the capacity to go down that hole.
Well, I would
Good.
like to hear what everybody.
And, right, and that's exactly where I was going. And so at this point, what I would like to do, thank you, Tim, is what I would like to do is open this up for community comment, and, you know, if you guys want to share your thoughts with us. Regretfully, you know, we still have to march up to the microphone. We all can't sit at the same table, which is what I'd really prefer to do. But if you guys would like to, you know, share your thoughts on the issue, we'd really like to hear it. And we'll start with Rob up in the front row and work our way back.
Thank you. I'm going to try and stick to a kind of a friendly script. Since we had our discussion, and first of all, we appreciate, this really is a discussion. No one's here with an axe to grind. We're just trying to understand the facts and where it goes. And to your point, not only is it, you know, I'm learned something new. Not only are we paying on the sliver of the street, but there's also the setback, which I believe is still public. Is that right or wrong?
Well, no, everybody suffers the setback.
No, but I'm.
I suffer a setback.
I mean, are they paying taxes on the
Oh,
setback?
yeah.
Okay, I feel better now. Okay.
No, we made special setbacks for the private roads.
I'm with you.
So we can screw them more.
I also appreciate the civil of the trustees reached out in advance to really better understand the concerns of both sides. And it's been, as you know, 10 years since the trap lane discussion. In the most simplistic form, I really am here only speaking on personal experience as the president of the Ardsley and Pelham Roads, not an association. I think we're all trying to flee from those terms as quickly as possible. Several other presidents of roads are here, and I've spoken with people in DeWint, and people are pretty much have a pretty common feeling about this as well. The problem is, despite we're paying more taxes in comparably sized lots on public streets because the property line extends to the middle of the streets, and despite that fact, Ardsley, Pelham, and other private roads do not enjoy the same level of services from the village that every other homeowner receives. We do not receive snow plowing, sewer maintenance and repair, street and curb maintenance and replacement, plantings and sign maintenance. In spite of the way private roads have been handled historically, we do not believe there is any issue that cannot be overcome with a discussion and agreement between the village and the private road residents going forward. The village is already providing refuse, recycling, police, fire, electric, and water to our roads. Both the private road homeowners and the village have noted the benefits of having private streets in the village. They do add charm and attractiveness to the village and separate us from other suburbs throughout the community. And the village receives more tax revenue, as we've discussed earlier. We do not necessarily want, and this is, I think, where we differ, which we talked today, we do not necessarily want to dedicate our streets back to the village and face the possibility of the village trying to make those unique and charming streets, to what Bob just said, into a more conforming cookie cutter approach, because I think it takes away, A, from our streets, but also from the village. It would greatly detract from how many of these private roads were designed and would cause much disruption to our properties, trees, and possible loss of value to our homes. I also understand that each private road is different, as we talked today and has been discussed here many times. There are different public benefits to making, to some versus others. Ours, as we discussed in Ardsley, is a real cut-through for 3 schools, Hubbard Woods School, Washburn, and Skokie. And it's a fun cavalcade of kids every day. It's a little more scarier cavalcade of big SUVs taking kids to school, and that's where it gets a little sketchy. And when things like plowing happen, I'm up at 5 a.m. to make sure that the roads are salted and plowed because we got kids coming down the street. And there's liability issues, but there's also just, we want the people to be safe that are using the road. So we are a private road that is used as a public road mightily. And to Ben's point, no one really wants to put up gates on Ardsley Road. I mean, according to Ben, I guess we could.
Depends on the easements and the documents that created the private road.
I'll take that as a yes. No, I mean, no one wants to do it, obviously. I mean, we're part of the community here. So we talked about the roads are different depending where they're located, access to each private road, whether it's pass-through or a street or a dead end, as a road has speed bumps. There's many, many considerations that the board has to deal with here. What we're trying to now make sure, and we've done it a little bit differently too. I looked at the Trap Lane situation, and that street got into a real state of disrepair. We have paved since I've lived on the street, we've repaved twice, we put in curbs, we've taken care of our storm sewers. I think what's also good on any type of drainage issues, I remember even back to the Nielsen's when they put in their own drainage to deal with the problems on the street. I put in drainage on my property to deal with and tie into the sewers. So people kind of have handled their own problem, and I think there are concerns on taking back, I would have to be concerned too if I were in your shoes, taking back a private street, which is basically want you to fix their problems. So it hasn't done anything for 25 years. So I understand each one will have different issues. Our first choice, obviously, is to stay private and have the village initiate the same services for our streets that every other Winnetka homeowner receives. The village study at the time of the Trap Lane review determined that no additional equipment or manpower would be needed to make that happen. That may just be for snow plowing. I don't know about the other services. The private roads we just heard are combined are only about 6 miles out of the 50-plus miles of roads in Winnetka. I know there may be other considerations or concerns on your part, and we appreciate your willingness to use this meeting as a way to get all the facts on the table so we can at least discuss them and debate them in a logical, constructive manner and come to a resolve that will be both fair to the private road homeowners and the village and the taxpayers. Thanks.
That's the equity conversation.
Can we ask Rob questions?
Why not?
Maybe we don't want to make.
All right, now that we got you up there, now we're gonna,
Well, I started this mess, so go ahead.
Just, the one question I had is.
Sure.
What it sounds like asking for is not to convert Ardsley to a public road, but rather to have access to the services the village would provide on any other.
That's our first choice. If there was what I could take back to the homeowners, beyond that, it's a pretty hard stop.
Right.
If we could take back an as-is discussion where the road is taken back, you're not going to widen it, you're not going to put in curbs, not going to put in sidewalks, which are going to people's property, because the roads weren't created that way in the first place. So some are more easily convertible than others. Ours would not be. Blackthorn probably wouldn't be. Many wouldn't. And so we'd rather, first would be, we pay as every other taxpayer in this community pays, we should get the same services. Go ahead. Go ahead. Please, please take the, okay.
And I like the idea of keeping those roads as they are.
Yep.
And the character and so on. However, you're a business guy.
Yes.
Just to be straight up here, a deal's a deal. And if you're you're a public road resident here, aside from having good feelings for our neighbors and that type of thing.
Sure.
Why would the village want to take on, forget the street plowing, that's peanuts. The maintenance, the long-term maintenance, infrastructure, et cetera, for the private roads when we don't have to? So what is the argument?
Are we putting a,
And those costs are not.
Do you want me to answer that?
No, I want him to answer that. 'Cause I want to know from a resident standpoint, how we could justify that, to take on, to leave the private road with you, and then take on the responsibility for the long-term maintenance of the road. Why would we do that?
Well, that's kind of a more basic legal question.
Yeah,
Probably
it's
Well, no,
not-
That goes back to the legal question.
Well, that may be, but I want to know what, I'd say there's public benefit to it. But why would we do it?
are we putting the matter of right and wrong aside, or just the fact that we had a deal 100 years
I
ago?
want to be convinced on why we should do that.
Why we should, I think the fact that we are paying the same amount of taxes that every other, I mean, if the right and wrong is, we're paying the same amount of taxes or
But we've
more
established that that's a very small amount.
on the sliver. On the overall, over the last 25 years or the last 50 or however long you own your home, I realize it's small, but it adds up.
Can I ask it a slightly different way?
Yeah.
So 10% of the miles of road in this village is private,
Yeah.
okay? So the maintenance of that 10% is not being paid for by the village. So hypothetically, what you are asking, I don't want to put words together, but what you're saying is, we want the village to add 10% more costs for road maintenance and pay for it, but we want to keep our road private.
But I'm not sure if it's 10%, and I have to know, because I saw in the last 10 years ago on the Trap Lane that no new equipment or manpower was needed.
I mean, I'm just going up, take all of our costs, divide it by the amount of roads, right?
It may be a percentage, I don't think it's going to be 10%.
Yeah, no,
Well, there's 6 miles and 50 miles,
Yeah,
so,
so it's a little bit more, but, and you're right, some of the roads may cost less to maintain, some more to
Yeah.
maintain. I'm just saying, the equation is kind of a take on maintaining and repaving and plowing, 10% more mileage and the cost associated with that, but we want to keep our private road. And take that 10% additional cost, spread it across the other 1,200 taxpaying households in this village, but we want to keep our private road.
and I think the important point to that, Scott, even beyond that, is that we haven't budgeted for it. So, I mean,
No,
certainly even if
this-
we figured it
I-
out,
I get it, I'm a business guy.
I mean, there's a
and I-
budget issue
I get
here
the
that-
discussion.
Yeah.
But the other part of my discussion is saying we've been subsidizing the rest of the village for 25 years.
thank you.
And that's wrong. I mean, it just is.
But you've been subsidizing the 52 miles of public road, just like I've been subsidizing
Yeah.
it, and Penny, and everyone who.
Yeah.
Right, so
But
we've
you don't
all
have
been
addition- but
subsidizing.
You don't have additional street costs.
Right.
But we don't have a
But we
private
don't have a
road.
private road.
And it's not so much the snow plowing or whatever, that's the easier part. It's
Yeah.
building or maintaining the road. If it's 10% more road, Public Works road budget has to go up 10%, which could affect the tax rate for the entire village.
Okay, well, let's
Okay, wait.
let Rob off the
Wait,
hook here.
Rob, I just, I
and let
want to throw
somebody
something.
come in.
These are good
Wait, I
questions.
want
These
to
are
throw
good
something out to
discussion.
Rob and for others who come up and.
Please.
Not free.
So is there a compromise position? Because it sounds like if I were you, I wouldn't want to get up at 5 in the morning and worry about the kids walking to school.
I don't want to,
Especially
yeah.
in this weather, it's really stressful.
Yeah.
So is there a compromise position to have a contract fee to pay for snow plowing services from the village so that you don't have to, because it is hard to get a private snow plower to show up at 5 in the morning. So could that be a net result, I don't know, legally, if private road
Well,
owners,
there's-
I would certainly be interested in that.
There's a couple things, and where we could go. And that would be version 3. One is we want you to just stop letting us subsidize the rest of the village and just take care of the services, I understand why you don't want to. Hopefully you understand our position as well. 2 is we bring our streets up, or if we want this service, we bring our streets up to maybe not to the 9 inches of village request, but it's an acceptable level. You don't, and we keep, and you take it back, or it's left as an as-is, but it's kept at an acceptable level, so you guys don't have the heavy burden of cost to, like you had on Trap Lane. Now, we've taken care of our sewers, we've taken care of our curbs, we've taken care of all this stuff in our drainage. I don't think there's gonna be a lot of cost on our street. Others, I won't say who they are, because it'll be on the record, have not. And, but I think that's version 2, where it's an as-is situation. We bring it up to a little level, to an acceptable level of service, where the village can then start taking on those without the big cost up front, which I think is the bigger concern.
Would that version involve dedicating
No.
the street to, so none of this would?
No.
Okay.
And
So,
go ahead.
it's a good point.
Well, 3 is not where we want to go, but it is even on getting up, well, I should say it's a part of, it's 2A, which is as we do this, and the village and Steve and Mehdi were great about working with us on, when we've already done our streets twice, tagging on to and Rob as well, on tagging on to the village contracts, which helps greatly the cost burden of us bringing our streets back up to speed, versus trying to find private contractors, private pavers, curb people, and that actually, we used that twice. We went on ALAM's contract, we paid specifically on the side. It was a separate contract, but it was at the village's rate. And that was a good way to at least help us get the streets up to speed the way you wanted them.
So then that would be, you would contract with the village to do the street maintenance?
Well, we contract with the village's suppliers
Yeah.
at their rate, at the village's rate.
I find it hard to believe that it would be more economical using union people versus a non-union company.
Well,
that's
but
private pay.
it's competitive bids and power buying, you know, I mean, when they're doing all that other work, it's easy enough for them to run the spreader box down another street.
Right.
And, you know, so there's some efficiencies of scale there that maybe offset the union thing.
Sewers and stuff like that, you know, contract, you know, that at least is to get it up to an acceptable level so the village doesn't have this, you know, $500,000 a street burden like you had on Trap. We're expected to do something, and hopefully then the village compromises and you take it from there.
I think the next conversation on this is we've got to have, I mean, if we do have another conversation, I have a sense we will, is to really be able to drill down on the numbers and understand what kind of dollars we're talking about, both relative to costs of maintenance, percentage of tax bill that goes to the 50, you know, we can extrapolate some of that just by knowing what it costs us to do the public roads. And there's a lot of other nuances here. Good example. Is anybody here from Sunset tonight? Sunset? No. But, you know, that's a road that's going to get, most likely, if the stormwater initiative moves forward, we have to put a big pipe down the middle of Sunset, or a couple small pipes, but it's going to come, something's going to come down Sunset, and they're going to end up getting a new road out of the deal at the end of the day, right? Maybe DeWint will if we have to run a big pipe down there. I don't know, Mike, but you know, the reality of it is there's another piece of the puzzle that's just not quite, you know, from an equity standpoint, I haven't got my head wrapped around it yet, because now they get a brand-new road, and obviously it's going to be built to a better specification, I would think, than what's there now, and, you know, how does that play into the whole maintenance equation? So I think we need to have hard numbers in front of us so we can be a little bit more intelligent on that conversation.
At least from my view, and I think some of the other men and women that are representing the streets, we're not looking for a handout. We're looking to say, well, some skin in the game. We just are trying to have the discussions. We have a policy
Oh,
going
yeah.
forward. Yeah.
That's what we're all here for.
Yeah. So we appreciate that dialogue. We really do.
Rob, just on
Yeah.
on option 2,
Yeah.
am I correct to say that your thought on that is bring the road up to standard and then dedicate it to the village?
No.
No.
Just keep it private. Well, it's a question unless the village, if we dedicate it, says in writing, we will never
You codify that.
put curbs, won't widen, we won't hold you to the same standards that we would normally do.
But that scenario could be acceptable to the neighbors.
I don't know. I'd have to sell it. And I know you guys have to sell it too. But it's more acceptable because it keeps the character of the neighborhood, which is,
Correct.
I think, what people want, more than anything else.
But then there is, they are deeding a portion of their property to the village to make that that option happen.
That would be part of it.
It lowers their tax rate, but it also lowers their acreage and their market amount. Well,
It's 1,200 square feet from here.
so, all right, Rob, I want to see if anybody else has got something they want to share. Steve?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Sure, thank you.
Good evening. My name is Steve Parker. I've been a resident in the old Green Bay Road for about over 30 years, during which I've seen it paved twice. And 5 years ago, I became a resident on Private Road. And I pretty quickly got into the scheme of things when I organized 27 residences to agree to pave my road, which was quite an ordeal. Getting 27 people to agree on anything was hard. But we did it, and $85,000 later, 4 years ago, we paved our road. Not without issues. I want to make a couple of comments tonight. Number one, I want to agree with Andrew, because Andrew got to the point, which is, this isn't about the $100 on our frontage. This is about the fact that all of us pay taxes, and all of us want representation, and we don't want to be dismissed. Okay, that's it. During the last 4 years, we've had several new houses go up, 2 of which were joyful heritage homes, during which I also learned that the permits that new builders pay has a portion in that building permit that they pay that is for road maintenance because of the damage that is done to the roads. And when I found out about this, I said, this is terrific. And I contacted the village, and I said, I would like that money. When ECA's taking it, I'm maintaining my road, I would like that money. And the answer I got back was, no. The big truck that's coming into town is going over Willow, going over Hibbard, and eventually making its way on private road. So it's really just the village's money. And I take that really just as a sign of disrespect and just no consideration for what's real. Because there isn't anyone here that hasn't seen a construction go up near them that notices what happens to the road in front of it. Okay, we've had these constructions on private road since our new pavement went down 4 years ago. And there's already damage where Leo did his construction. And you guys have our money. And again, it's kind of like Andrew's point. It's probably not a lot of money, but it's the consideration of it all. I've had other people tell me, you bought on a private street. You're getting what you bought in for. That's the deal. That's the way private streets work. I said, okay, well, they bought into a floodplain. They knew they were going into a floodplain. And you know what? I don't begrudge any of the money that I am paying in taxes that are going into this fantastically great water system that is helping all these people that have flood problems. But if I'm going to go ahead and help them, I don't get it why I don't get anything coming my way. I don't get it. If you look nationwide, and I've actually taken the time to do this, but if you look nationwide, a lot of private street issues that are similar to the ones that we're talking about tonight come about because there are towns that desperately want development in their town. And so they cut a sweetheart deal with a developer to go ahead and develop 30 acres and put in all these houses and everything else. And when they do that, they say, you make a private road, we'll give you even better deal. And everything gets cheaper as a result, and they can sell it cheaply to the people that end up buying those houses and everything else. So there's like an actual argument there that says, oh, well, you got it on the front end. You saved $30,000 on your house because you got the developer a great price because of the sweetheart deal that the town gave you. There isn't anyone here tonight that is living in a private street that hasn't been a private street for 50 or 100 years. None of these streets were developed because Winnetka gave it a sweetheart deal to a developer and said, just develop it as a private street and it will relieve us of all these obligations. So I agree with Rob. I don't think, and we have a number of private road people here tonight, for which I'm very proud and thankful. There's no one here that wants us to be a public street. We don't want you to take it back. We like the character of our street, and John hit it on the head when he said the reality is that these 6 miles of private street that are out there, it's cheaper for us to keep it because what you guys upgrade it to just doesn't make sense and is just more expensive. It's cheaper for us to keep it, but it doesn't mean that there can't be some sort of a collaboration to make it easier. I've paved the road at retail. I've taken care of storm sewers at retail. There's no reason I should be paying retail for these kinds of things. Every year we go out and we get a new snow plowing deal, or we call it Parks Plumbing, which, as you all know, have fantastic deals. And, you know, it just doesn't work well. So there has to be ways to help all of these residents, make it easier, realize that we are residents just like the folks that needed floodplain help. We didn't get here because of a great deal for a developer that developed all our streets. And we should have better consideration. Pay a lot of taxes. And I think it's fair for us to ask for some help and resources.
What are you asking for? I mean, I've heard what Rob's comments. Steve, what would your association want the village to do? Are you just asking to tap on to the village construction contracts?
Yeah,
What exactly?
so like, every single street is different. In private road, you know, we're lucky because we have a ravine. Everything, all the water just goes away, and we don't even have a storm sewer down our road. So we've got different issues than everybody else, but everybody has their own issues. But, you know, when I see the snowplows go by in Old Green Bay and they can't take a left down on private road, I'm kind of like, what's the biggie, you know? And by your own admission in your own packet for tonight, it says that there's no additional expense to go ahead and do exactly that. I don't get what that's an issue. I've got potholes that were caused by Leo. No money came back my way, but I've got to fix them. And I've got to go ahead and convince 27 people to go ahead and give me more money so that I populate my bank account and take care of that at retail. You know, those are simple things that if we could tap into the village contracts, if we could tap into simple things like snow plowing, that really isn't a big issue. But that's my issue. Other streets may have different issues. They may have storm sewer issues or stormwater issues that we don't have nearly as much. But it's the consideration.
What about the long-term infrastructure maintenance of the road? What are you looking for from the village on that?
Well, I think when I paved the road, it was a learning lesson for me because I was only a one-year resident when this whole thing came up, and I was working with all sorts of people that had been there 20, 30 years with a lot of history, and they don't want curbs. They don't want all of these restrictions that a lot of, you know, we like the feel and the character of our streets. And I don't even think that, you know, I don't think we're looking for you to take over all of our paving responsibilities or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, that would be great, but I don't expect that, and I don't think you'll ever do it. So I'm looking for something in between that I think would help us and be at least somewhat equitable.
I've got a question.
Sure.
And I know you're all from different associations or different, not associations, affiliations, I guess, private road affiliations, yes. You know, one of the issues, and I know this because I'm kind of a equipment geek, but, you know, the speed bump thing, especially the ones that private roads make, because they're not speed humps, those long, extended things. I mean, they're little short, chunky bumps. And plowing those things are a nightmare, and they're hard on the equipment and makes it hard to do a good job. And I'm sure that your private guys tell you the same thing, that, I don't know what you hear, Rob, but it's got to be a pain in the rear end.
So let me make a quick
So
comment.
the question is no, I mean, and then I got,
We've had the same guy doing it for as long as I can remember.
well, I will tell you, the big, you know, the big plows,
The big ones will cause problems.
yeah, the big, you know, the big plows mounted to six-wheelers and garbage trucks, I mean, that becomes a real issue. And the question is, I mean, and I don't mean for you to answer it, it's rhetorical, I mean, would the private roads give up their speed humps if the village was able to provide them with the
So
same
we-
service that everybody else
We
is
got
getting?
rid of ours, Chris. When I repaved, we got rid of ours.
Mm-hmm.
And my guess is if you look, probably at least half of them don't have speed bumps.
Well, I drive too fast and I find them
Well,
all,
that
so.
could be. But I mean, this is the issue of, I mean, okay, so if that's an issue, let's address that on the 10 of the 23 streets that have that issue.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I wouldn't make that a stopping point for the 10 that don't.
Oh, no, I'm just saying that
So,
that's the sort
I
of issues
agree.
that come up. that-
And we are a unique street because, and we put them in because of the kids. And not our, I mean, obviously our kids, but the kids that cut on them down.
They love those things.
They love them. But they're, so the SUVs, we're trying to slow down some of the parent traffic that cuts through because there are kids on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Around bends, and I'm not sure it really does it. It's a way to control speed.
I get it, but I'm just saying that is one of the, you know, physical obstacles to actually, and of course, if we ever got there, but it's just, I don't know how near and dear these things are to people because, and I see DeWint loves them and, you know, it's become part of the landscape. So, I mean, those are just the sort of issues.
Through it at extremely high speeds. And people want to cut through from Willow to, you know, to Dale Road. They go down to number 1 Oak. If there's traffic backed up from the trail, which happens every one.
Huh.
You can't go down Locust, so people cut off and cut through. And there are also a lot of kids walking to go out of it. So you have to, I mean, I personally think, that residents that will pick up the speed limit.
Just, yeah, and it really is a sidebar issue, but it's the sort of thing that if we started having those conversations, we'd have to navigate because, you know, I mean, jump in here, Jim, that can beat up those plows pretty good, especially those little ones, you know? So, I mean,
Chris, I'm
just
going
an
to make one
issue.
more comment. and
Sure,
I'm
go
gonna
ahead. I'm
Sit
sorry,
down,
Steve.
anybody else who wants to come up is great. But I also heard a lot tonight about, you know, village standards, and all that kind of stuff. And right across from Private Road is Hubbard Street. Hubbard Street is a public road. Hubbard Street probably isn't 22 feet. It sure doesn't have curbs, and it only has one sidewalk. So when I hear someone say, you know, we are 22 feet across with curbs and 5-foot sidewalks on both sides, it's just not the case. I mean, and I'm sure Hubbard isn't the only one. I'm sure there's a whole bunch that the village has said, yeah, we're fine.
No, as a matter of fact, Trap is 20 feet, right? If I'm not mistaken, Steve?
I mean,
It's
I'd be
20,
shocked if
and
you
there's no
couldn't come up with-
sidewalks.
I'd be shocked if you couldn't come up with 15 or 20 streets that aren't village code in terms of their streets and their sidewalks and everything else. So to hold us to that bar is just kind of silly. And we don't want to be held to that bar. We don't want sidewalks and we don't want curbs and we don't want to throw that in. We're with John. It's like we want to be more simple and keep it more economical and everything else. But we want consideration.
So I have a question for Ben. I'm done.
Go ahead.
Could the private streets make a deal for when they're gonna plow their streets? Is that a legal thing, or now we're plowing private property?
Well, I think we would have to look at a couple of things, one of which is the benefit to the village, and then also how it would impact our own services and contracting, and generally speaking, the rule is that we can't just gratuitously provide services because we want to. And that's not to say that it's, you know, not taking a moral stand, it's a matter of public funds generally cannot be used for the purpose of benefiting private owners. So if there was a deal to be structured, I think we'd have to look at, you know, the structure of the deal, how it impacts the village, what the public purpose is, and analyze it in terms of what we can do and what our statutory authority is and how far we can go to provide those services. So, you know, again, it's somewhat of a case-by-case basis. But to be clear, you know, while some of the conversation has talked about snow plowing being fairly de minimis compared to other types of road maintenance, the fact that it may be de minimis does not mean that we're permitted constitutionally to do it. So we'd have to, you know, I think about it and you know, and determine the exact structure and how it would work. Because public funds, whether it's de minimis or significant, you know, we're constrained in how we can use them.
But just, you know, most of those roads, as I'm listening to everyone, including my private road that's in front of my house, has tons of kids walking down it going to school. And so we're clearing privately, I don't want this to sound mean-spirited, but, you know, that is our responsibility to clear those roads and make sure that the kids and their parents and everyone can get through and ride their bikes if they're going to ride their bikes in the snow, whatever it is. And so I know they go down Ardsley, I know they go down DeWitt. I mean, the kids and the traffic that they're experiencing is public road benefit analogous traffic. I mean, we have pass-throughs that there were neighbors that didn't want to maintain them that sort of walk through woods to get from outside, you know, from across the street, across Hibbard, to get to Hubbard Woods School. And we invade upon the neighbors to keep those open, to not landscape them, so that those passages wouldn't be there anymore. And I think that they are deeded, that they have to be able to be passed, going from whatever it is, Kent to Chatfield, it's private there, and then through Auburn, it doesn't actually connect all the way, it's a footpath. But the neighbors all keep that clean. And so, you know, whatever, I mean, I think there is a public benefit going on with people on private roads. I think they're publicly minded, so that argument, just saying.
I'm not this, but I'm just trying to understand the definition of private roads and public funds on private land. It seems like a very old time.
Well, what underlies the road? That's the problem, is that you own up to the middle of your lot, so it is private
I
land.
think it's talking about private land that's in somebody's estate, or, I don't think it's been on homeowners that are paying taxes.
That's why we have the answer man here
I'm
tonight.
just trying to understand what
There's the legal answer, but I think you're getting at a practical, right? There's a difference between like a Glen Oak Drive, right, on the east side of Sheridan where there's 3 houses, versus Ardsley where it isn't, right? So there's the legal definition of private. What you're saying is, right, we don't have a gate there, we're not allowing people to go through only with passes and things like that. But we have a legal obligation to abide by the legal standard of what private is.
In the legal
The
definition.
legal definition.
Is it possible if we determine the actual cost to plow that extra road, is it legal for the village to contract with the homeowners for them to pay the city for that work?
So,
And the only issue there then obviously.
Well, we do that. There's a lot of instances where we do that, just like
Associated with plowing.
So-
I think if the policy direction is to explore different avenues of services that, and partnerships and things that you can do, you know, we can come back to you with some guidelines and guidance for how it could be done, if you want to pursue that, or what can't be done. But I will say that it is a nuanced issue that's not so straightforward as, yes, tomorrow you can go out and sign a contract and just, you know, have people tack on all the time. You know, and I think part of it is think about, we do purchasing for things in the village all the time, but it's not as if we can just necessarily have somebody piggyback on our contracts. for any reason, I mean, so it has to be studied on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I don't want to raise my hand and say, hey, do
And-
my driveway too this year.
Yeah,
Right.
first thing that went into my mind, so, all right, well, let's go back to the audience. I want to make sure we get through here and try to get out by 9 o'clock. Would anybody else like to speak? Come on up.
Hi, my name is Nancy Isaacson, and I've lived on Hoyt Lane for 20 years. I don't know if you are aware of where Hoyt is. It connects Elm Street to Oak Street at the lake. And we have 5 riparian homes on Hoyt Lane, and we've been paying taxes for a long time. Recently we've started contracting with snowplowers, but I would say because we don't have sidewalks, people are forced to walk a lot on Hoyt, and we don't have anyone to salt. So you can say snowplows are a small issue, but where do we get professional salters? I don't believe we have had any access to any village, and I'm not sure if you had said that the village does offer snowplow contracts to private roads or
No.
not? No, okay. So if you're looking at just snowplow, Hoyt would like salt as well.
So, Nancy,
Where do you-
Snowplow comes down Elm, lifts up the snowplow,
Goes
goes down.
down.
3 houses on each side, and then puts the snowplow down on Oak. So,
Yes.
I mean, it
that's to
really
save
saves
money, though. We do that to save money.
Put that snowplow down.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Come on up.
Hi, I'm Liz Kunkel. I live at 1303 Holly Lane. We're a very small street. We have 4 houses. The 4th one got added on 10 years ago, so they wouldn't be a Hibbard Road address. They'd be a Holly Lane address. So they could sell their house, which happened. And so I grew up in Winnetka. I didn't even know Holly Lane existed until I moved back here 10 years ago. And when we bought the house a year later, we didn't even know it was private. Whoever said, you know what you're getting into, you signed on for it. We had no idea. We didn't even know it was private. I mean, we didn't know, and we absolutely did not know what that meant in terms of responsibilities for the upkeep of the lane. And on Holly, just like on Plumtree to our north, there aren't houses on both sides of the street. They're on the north side only. So we own the whole lane. It doesn't split in the middle. And there's one issue that really hasn't come up, which is not just the taxes, but the stormwater fee. We're responsible for that entire stormwater fee of the lane. It's not buildable land. It's not usable land. The property taxes have obviously been going up. We've dealt with it. We're the house that's second to the west from Hibbard, and then there's another house to the west of us, and the one on the 4th house, or the furthest west house. My understanding is the house is at the corner of Hibbard and Holly, and the one at the end of Holly, both tie into the storm drains, one on Bell and one on Hibbard. But our 2 houses, the house to the west of us doesn't tie into any storm drain, and we didn't until we took it on our own and tied into the Hibbard Road drain on our own dime. After, by the way, having installed 20,000 gallons worth of water holding tanks in our yard, also at our own expense, which we don't get any credit for the village for at all, because we can't pipe the water out of the village and we don't clean it. But we manage it, we don't dump it on our neighbors, and we took all of that on. We didn't ask for anybody's help, we didn't go to our neighbors, we just dealt with it. So I really want to thank Mr. Apatow and the non-associations, but the neighborhoods for raising this issue, because we've been thinking about it. I just became aware it was on the agenda tonight on Friday when I happened to catch the village newsletter that this was the issue, and it's good timing for us. So I want to thank you for bringing it back into the conversation. We don't have a specific ask on Holly. We get that everybody's different, and again, it's a new issue, but collaboration. I want to thank President Rentz for raising the equity issue. To us, that's what it comes down to. We are paying the taxes, we're bearing a lot of this burden, and we're not getting the full benefit of it. And to answer, but Trustee Kripe asked earlier, what was the resistance of some of the trap lane homes years ago, and I don't know what their issues were, but I know a number of years ago when we had this discussion on Holly, there were 2 different homeowners of the 2 houses that are the furthest west on our lane, and they were the homeowners who'd been there the longest. They were technically the oldest, but they were not old, but they were long in the community, and their answer was, it ain't broke, don't fix it. And that was it. They were like, it was always been this way, it's fine. We were 3 houses, they didn't want the 4th added because they thought that was enough of a change. And that's a lot of it. So it's not necessarily, anyway. Thank you for raising the issue. Thank you for considering the issue. To me, the equity reason is the most compelling, and to me, that provides a public benefit. You're creating an equitable community. That's the public benefit. So, thanks.
Thanks, Liz. Mr. Canman.
The much talked about DeWint Road. I'm the former president. I've lived on the street for almost 17 years now. I think first off, I appreciate the consideration, and Mr. Apatow, obviously equitability, looking at the sewer fees on our utility bills, looking at the permittability fees and issues with respect to the stormwater fee. But I think a lot of these things, the residents of DeWint are very comfortable maintaining. The plowing, we have a person that will salt. Phil Hosa will be over in a minute. He's on my speed dial. Okay, we're there are guys. We have a contract, we've bid for repaving, which we'll do once the weather breaks. So those issues are there. And not to bring up old subjects, it's a totally different meaning, it's stormwater. And I appreciate that the people to the east don't think they caused the flooding to the west, and that Leo hasn't caused it all throughout the village. But that's a separate issue. But that's the single most important thing for the residents of DeWint. We're providing support for the people that pass through. That we did buy into. We knew that we were going to plow the street. We knew there was a fee for the association that's not an association to maintain that. That's okay. We're not going to widen it. The residents do not want to give property back to the village. We have a guy, he shows up with a little skid steer, 3 in the morning, plowing the street, and you hear him when it snows. And you contract to 1 inch of snow, and they're out there. So those things are all manageable. The thing that isn't manageable is the fact that, as Chris, you and I have talked about, and Steve, Bob, we've been here before. It seems like a little bit of deja vu. We have a 100-year-old storm sewer system. And the residents of Sunset, they're actually on the DeWint storm sewer. And have a pump. We've upgraded the pump. We've talked to Chris Burke. We've got it all down. We're ready. And those things are there. It's all about the storm sewer. And the other things, yes, we would like equitable relief of fees. Who wouldn't? But those things we can manage. A little bit to Andrew, sorry, he left, point. The one that isn't the rabbit hole is the stormwater issue. So I thank you, appreciate the consideration, and happy to answer any questions.
Don't go away.
I won't.
Oops, sorry. My question is, I just want to have you state for the record, just so I understand and we're all on the same page. You say the stormwater, of course, is the issue for you all. What exactly would you, if it was a perfect world, what would you want the village to do for you all relative to?
I'm no longer an officer, fortunately, so I don't have to go out, show up late at night. We have a pump. We are ready to go in. We cut across to a pumping station in Mount Pleasant and one at Crow Island School, and then we pump west. So I know there's been a lot of negotiations with
Meaning you just want the stormwater taken care of. You don't want the
I would have
want
gone.
the village to do anything within the DeWint Road area.
No.
Oh, okay.
He just
Okay, I
needs
just
a
wanted to
place
be
to
clear.
The village can pump its own stormwater.
Right.
And if they could solve that, we can solve ours.
I
We've
just-
actually got a solution to ours.
As I said, I just wanted you to say
No,
for the record.
yeah.
Sorry. It was
And
implied but not said.
Does your area have an actual association or just a bunch of homes?
We have an association.
Okay, and that's been around? since they
Well,
were built?
a long story, but we had to reformulate it and officially do it, but it lapsed, but it's back, and there are
And
22
people
houses.
Yearly put on?
Pay yearly, we just put through an assessment for the repaving the road, their yearly dues, and it's sort of,
Can I ask about how much those yearly dues are? Just,
yeah, $2,000.
okay, all right, good, thanks.
And, and that's.
It adds up.
It adds up, it's a cost, and, to the point that if the village could bring their, skid steer down and do it, but it's tough, and we recognize that, and we recognize we want the speed bumps.
So the $2,000 is mostly snow plowing
Snow plowing,
and some maintenance?
some maintenance,
pumps.
some insurance,
Okay.
the
Paving.
pumps. We occasionally, we have a,
Repay.
excuse me?
You got to accrue money to repave it.
Repaving it, well, there's going to be a special. But there is, like the village, it's a 100-year-old storm sewer, and it occasionally goes out, and we do it. We have a pump at the corner of Sunset and DeWint,
Thanks.
Sure.
See, John was thinking of moving back there, and you just killed the deal for him, so. Anybody else want to share their thoughts? Come on up.
So I'm Debbie Hirsch. I also live on private road. And I think everything was extremely well articulated here. But the one thing I'm seeing is, I think the goal really is cooperation and give back and compromise. And maybe it's our current political system, I don't know, but it just seems that that's not, that we're getting into the weeds on both sides a little bit. And so I would encourage you to think about a lot of the benefits that these communities have brought together. For example, we do pay for paving. We do pay for, I can tell you personally on the storm sewer standpoint, when we built, and we didn't build through a LEO, so we actually had to put all sorts of storm sewers in. The village required it on a ravine to ease generally others. We weren't afforded that same benefit by the village when LEO came in. They in fact dug a 10-foot by 10-foot by 10-foot hole on my property. No recourse for that, no help on that. We had to go sue them and get an injunction. So there are a lot of things that go on in private roads that are not addressed by the village, which we understand in part, and I quite frankly disagree with in part. But I think the bottom line is, instead of slicing and dicing, well, do we plow this road, do we not plow that road? I think generally speaking, and I can speak for private road, that it's an access point through. It's for schools, it's for school buses, it's for people going to the beach, it's people coming from the beach. There's all sorts of reasons. We got rid of the speed bumps, as we've said. So I think in doing the granularity of the discussion of the private and public benefit and whether there are speed bumps, I think we can get to a benefit and an argument in a discussion and a defensible position with respect to the public and private benefit issues there, because I think we have to look at it in the totality of things as we're doing them and exploring them. So I would just encourage that in thinking about it, and not, I understand we have to break it down to a certain extent, but I think thinking in a more global way about how the private streets benefit the community and vice versa is just important, and I just raise that as well. I will also say that there are a lot of things that we don't get that seem quite odd to me. For example, my parked car on my road was struck and hit, and it was a hit and run. The police came, they figured out who the owner was, and yet they said, well, they couldn't issue a ticket because it's on a private road. Okay, so there are weird things like that that just don't make sense. And so I would say that I don't know where that falls, but I just want to recognize that I think the village creates sometimes unnecessary tension, as quite frankly sometimes the residents do too. We're the first to admit that, no doubt. But I think we do need to look at it, as I said, without being, listening to all the good points that were made. We still are a community, and there's a lot of benefit there that we can benefit from. And when it comes to streets and going back and talking about the strips and the rabbit hole, I understand all that, but this has been accumulating, and this frustration, if you will, has been accumulating for 30, 40, 50 years. To someone else's very good point, this isn't a 10-year benefit here. So we've been paying in and getting nothing for years and years and years. And I think that has to be addressed too from an allocation and equity standpoint. So I know that's a very broad comment, but I just wanted to make it to kind of bring everything together, because I think all the points are really good and really valid, but I think it would serve us well to act in a community fashion and recognize the benefits that both bring to the table. So thank you.
Sure, and just to point out, the reason why we're having this discussion is because we recognize that there are some potential differences of opinion across the community, and the way that you solve those is to first get them out on the table and start to have the conversations, understand where people's pressure points are, understand where our legal limitations are. Now, finding out that Springfield has something to say about this kind of colors the whole conversation differently in my mind. And, it's something that we always have to keep in the back of our minds, that we are restricted somewhat just simply by state law. And, it's too bad that Ben has to be the buzzkill on some of these conversations, but that's just the way it is, Yeah, so that's what he gets the big bucks for. But, the reality of it is that to have these conversations and to exchange these ideas is exactly what you were talking about, right? I mean, unless we're enlightened as to what the issues are, what the concerns are, what the potential wants are, and what the don't wants are, I mean, you really can't even have a policy discussion unless you have that input. And tonight was wonderful because this is about the most people we've had since early Winnetka, right? So I was getting bored of talking to two people, so I decided to get something that would stir the pot up and get a bunch of people out into the seats for a change, and it looks like mission accomplished there. You know, we can beat this thing to death, but I think unless somebody thinks otherwise, I think this might be worthwhile, some more conversations and, you know, scheduling up once we have a chance to kind of absorb what we've heard here, Rob.
Yeah, sure. So there's two different things that I think we all heard tonight. One, which Steve kind of articulated, which is there a way for a private road entity to buy into, to join in the buying power of the village, right? That's, you know, I recognize, you know, Ben, that there are kind of legal restrictions there, but that's one dimension of the analysis, which is just what kind of offering can be made and what would be the criteria that associations would have to meet to do that. I think the second question, the one that Rob kind of brought up is, you know, how do we or can we take on maintaining a road that stays a private road? And it sounds like legally we are pretty tightly constrained on that. So I guess the second thing that I'd like to have is, it's more than a village policy question, which is if a group of people said, we want the village to take on maintaining this, I think there is a value to maintaining the character of some of these streets and these neighborhoods. So understanding what the policy flexibility is that we want to have, where we could say, all right, you can either A, buy into the village's purchasing power, or B, if you want us to take it on, you got at least meet this minimum level, and oh, by the way, the street's no longer private, it's got to become public, but you can maintain some aspects of the character. And I guess figuring out what those aspects of the character are would be kind of helpful to understand on the policy decision.
Well, and the only, you know, the 1994 policy that we're still looking at here, right? I mean, and actually Steve made a bunch of modifications to it that council never studied again. Right, Steve? Yeah. I saw a red line in there that I think was a lot of that stuff. But, you know, that's one, now how far can we go left or right of that before we end up getting into trouble?
And to
or
complicate it even more, right, there are roads that are, private roads that are really public roads, like a DeWitt, a White Oak, you know, an Ardsley. And then there are private roads that are really kind of private roads, right? They're, you know, 3 houses and on a street leading to nowhere.
Liz.
Right? And so how much do we factor
Lucky you.
that in? Yeah, you know, how does that get factored in?
They use our driveways as turnarounds.
And that's where equity gets to be the real struggle, right?
Right.
Because we have so many different flavors here that.
And to take it up to sort of a higher conceptual level, you know, the issue of, as was talked about in terms of the public benefit that's been being given by private roads, and so how do you consider that in terms of, you know, roads like, particularly like Sunset and Ardsley that are used a lot by the general public, and, you know, how do we think about that? The flip side is how do we think about liability? And again, as having been responsible for a while for a private road, ours was used a lot by commuters, and one of our questions is what was our liability as a private road relative to the public use? So, you know, that is something I think that we need to understand, and also if we take over any responsibility for a private road, where, you know, what's the liability for the village and all that. You know, I think it is an intriguing question, and certainly there are a lot of different aspects we need to think about it.
Yep. Any last thoughts, guys?
So how do we not let this go another 10 years?
Well, I'll just keep poking at it.
You guys put it on the list, so
What is, are we asking for,
Well, I'll sit down, I'd like them to absorb, Steve and Rob and Tim and Jim, and sit down and really think about what they've heard tonight, put it against the backdrop and the framework of what they know to be the hard facts, and, we start to structure this thing a little bit.
Right.
And you'll let me see the agenda packet before it goes out this time. I didn't know that. But it is the sort of thing that you got to keep poking at, and now that it's in the cycle, and to be real honest with you, the story was, Ed had a lot to do. I mean, he had 5 months left, and this was not on his front burner at all. And so he passed it off. Jessica didn't have an appetite for it. If you read the minutes, Gene was definitely just leave it like it is, and so he didn't have an appetite for the conversation. But enough people asked me the same questions, and with stormwater out there, I mean, we really need to know what's going on, because stormwater is going to create issues that we should have policies for before we start ripping up streets and putting pipes in. And we should know what our liabilities and our rights are and our obligations are as we start to, if we move ahead and start to implement that. So, great. All right, well, thanks, everybody. It was a good conversation. Kind of nice change of pace. So, with that said,
I would just say, we should probably try and get names of people on all the different private streets, so the next time we have a conversation.
I've already asked him.
We send an email.
Yeah, we don't have a database of all the contacts, so we're going to start working on that as well. But thanks, everybody, for coming. May I have a motion to adjourn? Voice vote, all those in favor?
Aye.
Meeting stands adjourned at 9 o'clock. Thank you.